Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I would like to call this committee meeting to order as permitted by the Governor's Disaster Declaration of September 16th, 2022. The determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee to meet in person. So to ensure a transparent and open meeting as possible, we'll post the meeting materials approximately 1 week in advance and provide a recording of this meeting linked on the Cmap website and take all votes by roll call. I believe staff has some additional virtual meeting logistical announcements to share before we take the roll.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. We wanted to just let everyone know, as you've already heard, that this meeting is being recorded. I think we're all pretty familiar with Zoom protocol at this point, but just to go over that one more time, we'd ask you to please use the mute function when you are not speaking, which will help eliminate excessive background noise. And you can use the mute button, or for those of you on the phone, you can press *6 to mute and unmute yourselves. For members of the public, if you have a question during the meeting, please use the chat box, which staff will be monitoring. Additionally, if you wish to address the committee during the public comment agenda item, you can indicate your desire to do so using the chat box. For members of the committee, when making a motion, please include your name so staff can properly record it. And as far as the chat goes, we would encourage people as much as possible. If you want to make a comment, please let us know in the chat box rather than writing out the comment in full. We just want to be sure that we give everyone a chance to make their comment verbally so that it can be added to the recording, which we will post on the Cmap website and our YouTube channel, just to make sure that we're capturing everything that you have to say. So that concludes my meeting announcements. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We'll move on to the roll call. So if the staff could please call the roll.
Sorry about that. Phone call coming in on the actual phone. If you give me just a moment while I call up the roster. Okay, so for the roll call, again, if you could please just unmute and tell us whether you are present. Chair Aaron Dernbaugh.
Present.
Vice Chair Deborah Stone.
Present.
Jack Chan.
Present.
Naomi Davis. Martha Dooley. Elena Grossman. Cynthia Canner.
Present.
Marcella Bondi. Elizabeth Coach.
Present.
Thomas Maillard.
Present.
Edith Macra. Raid Mansour.
Present.
Paul May. Mary Nickel.
Present.
Vanessa Ruiz. And Jen Walling.
Here.
Great, we have a quorum.
Thanks so much. Moving into the agenda, are there any agenda changes that we should be aware of?
No agenda changes from us, thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to announcements. So for announcements, I'd first like to welcome back the committee members after a nice long summer break. Hopefully it was restful. As a reminder of our role and the responsibilities as members of the Climate Committee for Cmap, we're a committee of the Cmap board and are charged with contributing to the agency's mission and supporting the implementation of the agency's strategic direction and the long-range transportation plan. We are also responsible for broadening regional awareness of and support for the agency's climate-related initiatives, reviewing and providing input to the agency on its strategic direction, work plan, and climate-related projects, and bringing a broad regional perspective to the agency's climate-related initiatives, and expanding the agency's expertise on specific climate issues and geographies. The Climate Committee meets once per quarter, and each of the meetings this year is broken down into themes based on Cmap strategic direction. In February, we provided input to the strategic direction In May, we reviewed the Climate Mitigation Work Plan and discussed the agency's approaches to achieving its objective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the region's transportation system. Today, we will review the agency's Climate Resilience Work Plan, and in November, the meeting's theme will be water resources. I'd personally like to thank you for your continued commitment and support of this work. The other announcement I have is related to the departure of two of our committee members. Stacy Myers, formerly of Open Lands, has taken a position with the US EPA, and Ted Penesis retired from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. On behalf of the Climate Committee, I'd like to thank them for their service. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Cmap's Executive Director, Aaron Alleman, who is with us today and has a few words to share with the committee. Aaron?
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Chair Bob, for your reiterating the goals of this committee. I think it's helpful to understand why we're here, given the fact that we haven't met in a little while. But we are excited again to be talking with you about our work related to climate, one of our core focus areas in implementing the 2050 plan. Just a couple notes here. I wanted to emphasize a few things that you'll be hearing today, but one of the things that I thought might be of interest was that when the Cmap board met last week, we've been talking a lot about how our region recovers from the pandemic, specifically how it relates to our transportation sector and how travel patterns are changing across the region. You know, one of the things that I'm sure this committee thinks a lot about is how our transportation infrastructure impacts our greenhouse gases, our air quality across the region, and with people choosing to drive more frequently rather than take the train, you know, the shifting travel patterns could have a big impact on our future air quality here. So we've been trying to wrap our arms around some big picture policies that we might need to put in place, but I imagine we will bring a lot of this work here to the committee to hear from you directly as to what your perspective is and how we should approach these changes in the future. Today on your agenda, you're going to hear a little bit about our strategic direction. Our staff will provide an update, including some approaches and objectives of the climate focus area. Again, since implementing our changes to our committees, we've been refining our approaches and working with you and really making sure that our work is strategic, that it aligns with what we're charged to do as an agency, but also helps us complement the work that you all are doing. You'll also hear from staff on our state and federal legislative agendas as well. And you'll see that our strategic direction, the climate focus area, will be a part of our state and federal legislative agendas. And then staff is going to provide an update of our resiliency plan and engage you in a discussion on that work. I also just wanted to highlight and emphasize, I know you'll be hearing a lot about our greenhouse gas inventory today. We talked to you about this in May, but later this week, we will share updated data publicly. As you recall, we do this greenhouse gas inventory about every 5 years to understand emissions in Northeastern Illinois. The most recent inventory uses 2019 data due to the pandemic and the subsequent stay-at-home orders. We believe that 2019 data is more representative of the long-term trends in the region than 2020. However, the data shows that between 2010 and 2019, overall greenhouse gas emissions in Northeastern Illinois decreased by 9%. So when I first read that, I was like, well, we're making progress, right? But when we look at our goals that we set forth in 2050, you know, our regions really needs to be focused on reducing emissions annually by 5% through 2050. So we're committed to arming our partners with comprehensive data and analysis in order to solve these complex, challenging problems like climate change. We hope that by using our data and working together, we can take action to improve our region's environment, our ecosystems, our health, and our well-being. So we've got some pretty exciting data summaries that we'll be releasing as well by county, by community, and by Chicago area neighborhood to provide that snapshot, that moment in time, really as a starting point for, you know, measuring where you're at today. And with the hope that we continue to do this in the future, we can see the changes move in a positive direction. And down would be the positive direction to benefit the region. So our goal for the region from the 2050 plan is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% relative to 2005 levels by 2015, which aligns with the Paris Agreement's goals of keeping global warming to below 2% Celsius. So again, we'll share this information with you. You'll be able to access it on our website. We'll have a dedicated page that'll be at cmap.is/GHG inventory. But again, we'll send you those links as well. And in closing, just in yesterday's Regional Economy Committee, I told them about the meeting we had last week with our county board chairs, the City of Chicago, and economic development leaders from across the region. We've been working with them closely to achieve consensus around regional economic collaboration. You know, I was thinking about the progress we were making across all of the portfolios of our work, our resiliency, our accessibility work, our safety work, and our equity work, and some of the infrastructure investments and programming that we do here across the region. With new funding through IIJA and also through the climate bill that I can't remember what the acronym is for it right now, but the new federal bill, you know, I think that there really is a big opportunity for us to move the needle on our region's shared priorities and a strong commitment for us to really work together because we are truly stronger together. So I want to thank you again for your commitment to improving the region through our work and partnership with this committee, and we look forward to continuing to work with you to advance our shared goals. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Director Alleman. Does anyone in the committee have any questions for Aaron? Hearing none, we will move on to our next item. Thank you so much, Aaron. Thanks for being with us. The next item is approval of the minutes. A copy of the minutes from May 24th, 2022 was included in the meeting packet. Were there any requested changes or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, could I ask for a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
Cynthia Canner, I move to accept the minutes from the May meeting.
Thank you, Cynthia. Could I get a second?
Second, Thomas Maylard.
So the minutes were motioned by Cynthia and seconded by Thomas. Any questions on the motion to approve the minutes? Hearing none, staff, could you please read the call or call the roll? Sorry.
Thank you. And if members could please unmute as they vote on this motion. Aaron Dernbaugh.
Approve.
Deborah Stone.
Aye.
Jack Chan.
Aye.
Naomi Davis. Martha Dooley.
Yes.
Elena Grossman.
Aye.
Cynthia Canner.
Aye.
Marcella Bondi.
Yes.
Elizabeth Coach.
Yes.
Thomas Maylard.
Aye.
Edith Macra.
Aye.
Raed Mansour.
Aye.
Paul May. Mary Nickel.
Aye.
Vanessa Ruiz. And Jen Walling.
Aye.
Great. The motion carries.
Thanks so much, Brian and everyone. Our next item on our agenda includes a proposal to change the next scheduled meeting from November 22nd, 2022 to November 29th, 2022. And this was due to some conflicts with member availability for a meeting so near the Thanksgiving break. So for this one, I just need a motion and a second to approve changing the meeting from November 22nd to November 29th.
Martha Dooley, I make a motion to approve.
Thank you, Martha.
Elizabeth Coach, second.
Thank you, Elizabeth. There is a motion by Martha Dooley and a second by Elizabeth Cook to move the date of the next meeting from the 22nd to the 29th of November. Any questions on the motion? If not, staff, if you could please call the roll.
Thank you. Aaron Dernbaugh.
Approve.
Deborah Stone.
Approve.
Jack Chan.
Approve.
Naomi Davis. Martha Dooley.
Approve.
Elena Grossman.
Approve.
Cynthia Canner.
Approve.
Marcella Bondi.
Yes.
Elizabeth Coach.
Approve.
Thomas Maylard.
Approve.
Edith Macra,
Approve.
Rid Mansour,
Approve.
Paul May, Mary Nicole,
Approve.
Vanessa Ruiz, and Jen Walling.
Approve.
Great, and the motion carries. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, staff, and thanks for going through those agenda items. Next up on our agenda is an informational presentation from Cmaps on Cmap strategic direction, approaches, and measures. So I'm going to hand it over to Alex Ensign, for the Director of Strategic Alignment and Innovation, for a presentation on this topic. Alex?
Thank you, Chair Turnbaugh. Good morning, everybody. This will actually just be a very quick update, but I wanted to make sure to update you all on the process we're making with the strategic direction. So I started at Cmap about 6 months ago, and I think I had just started when I was kind of delving into some of these committee meetings. But what I realized pretty quickly was that even though the committees were providing really substantive feedback to the strategic direction, we hadn't actually given enough of an opportunity for all of our staff to become acquainted with the strategic direction and also to provide some feedback within the agency. So one of the decisions that I made pretty quickly was to have a series of workshops over the summer. So we held 10 workshops, just internal workshops with Cmap staff over the summer to try to connect the strategic direction more to the projects that we're currently working on, some of our program areas, and provide opportunities for staff to provide feedback and ask questions about the strategic direction, how it aligns with On to 2050. Those were really well-attended workshops, and I think were very helpful for grounding some of our work that we're currently doing in the strategic direction. Every single member of Cmap staff attended at least one, and some attended 5 or 6 workshops. So they were very well attended. In addition to the workshops that we held, which were, we started with workshops for each division, and then we held workshops in each of the focus areas. And then just to make sure we were covering all of our bases, we also held workshops in cross-focus areas. So we held a workshop on climate and transportation, climate and economy, economy and transportation, and economy and climate, to think really critically and intentionally about how some of our approaches in each of those areas might dovetail or have synergies with other approaches, or how they might be in tension with some of the other approaches, so that we can make sure we're really very careful and very thoughtful when we're thinking about recommendations for transportation that don't negatively impact climate, or work that we're doing to mitigate climate that's not necessarily at odds with some of our recommendations in the economy focus area. So those workshops have been incredibly helpful in basically creating a version 2 of the strategic direction, which is what we're working on right now. So we're taking all that feedback from the committee meetings in the spring, all the feedback from these workshops, and we're just adding a lot more to the strategic direction. And what our plan is to present a draft of the strategic direction at the committee meetings in November, to provide a little bit more feedback on the version 2 that incorporates some of your feedback, and then finesse that and present it to the board in January to adopt. I think that's end of my update. Let me check my notes. Yeah, just want to thank you for your really excellent feedback in the meetings earlier this year. I think a lot of that will be incorporated into the climate focus area for the strategic direction, so I really appreciate it. Any questions?
Thanks so much, Alex. If there's no questions by any members of the committee, we'll move on to the next agenda item. Appreciate the update.
Thank you.
Our next item is the Cmap state and legislative agenda. And I'm going to hand it over to John Carpenter, Legislative Affairs Director, Tim Mcmahon, Senior Specialist, and Kasha Hart, Senior Specialist for this presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is John Carpenter. I'm the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, still the relatively new director here at Cmap. And I'll let Tim and Kasha go through the details of our state and federal advocacy agenda. We are just about wrapped up, putting together both state and federal advocacy agendas. They will fall into three broad categories, which Tim and Kasha will go through, but the focus of each is very specific and very important. The focus of the federal advocacy agenda will be seeking funding and implementation of all the initiatives that came out of the IIJA. There's plenty of opportunities there. We're going through it right now, and it's important that we secure funding and implementation of all the initiatives that came out of that legislation. The focus of our state legislative advocacy agenda will be seeking legislation to fulfill the requirements and the enumerated responsibilities laid out in the Regional Planning Act. The problem here is that the funding is limited basically to transportation projects. We have to seek philanthropic and grant money to fulfill the rest of the requirements. So we'll be seeking legislation from the General Assembly to allow us to add that capacity to address all the issues laid out by the Regional Planning Act. The responsibilities are numerous. The legislature has not funded them. So we are in the process now of putting together legislation which will fund Cmap to expand capacity to allow us to address those issues, and furthermore, expand capacity to address all the initiatives coming out of the federal legislation. So with that, I will turn it over to Tim and Kasha. Tim, I think you're up next.
I am. Yeah. Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Mcmahon. I'm an Intergovernmental Affairs Senior on our Intergovernmental Affairs team, and I work on our federal engagement. So with our federal agenda this year, as John said, it's broken down into transportation, climate, and regional economic competitiveness. Our primary focus, obviously, across this whole agenda, especially the transportation section, is the successful implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That includes increasing local access to funding programs that were authorized but have yet to be funded, such as the Healthy Streets program for resilient infrastructure investments, the Active Transportation Infrastructure program for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. Both of these programs would be great resources directly to our region as a whole, as well as all of our individual communities. So we want to make sure those get funded. It also includes increasing local access to federal safety formula funds. So MPOs like Cmap have funding to meet federal safety performance management goals. The last section in the transportation area has been a long-standing recommendation across all levels of government for Cmap, which is sustainably funding the transportation system. That includes development of new funding mechanisms or pilots nationally, such as a national road usage charge pilot. And then onto the climate section recommendations. Those primarily focus on reducing emissions and enhancing the resilience of the region. And so starting there, and this is where we want to make sure we have time for questions and can get as much feedback as possible from you all. The first section is primarily focused on strengthening federal standards, federal emission standards, as well as continued support for the transit system. As we all know, the transit system received historic bipartisan levels of operating support during the pandemic. And we know that they'll continue to need that support as ridership rebounds in the coming years. The next section captures our resilience recommendations, including ensuring the region-wide resilience plan Cmap is developing can be used to increase the federal share to 90% for all of the new Protect, Resilient formula and competitive funds that we're going to be seeing. The last category of recommendations, their focus is on regional economic competitiveness. So beginning with that first section of inclusive growth, during the pandemic and some of the American Rescue Plan, some of those bills that came out, the Economic Development Administration received historic levels of funding for regional investment for programs like the Build Back Better Challenge. These one-time funding opportunities were very popular. They were regional in focus, which is what we like to see as an agency, especially from federal opportunities. It was very oversubscribed, and we think that should be continued in the long term. And then the next section we have here calls for including, sorry, my notes are a bit turned around, increased comprehensive support for investment decisions, right? So at the intersection of housing, economic development, and transportation, specifically with regions like ours, we'd like to see more comprehensive support and technical assistance, not only from U.S. Department of Transportation, especially as we'll have new housing coordination plan authority, but also from the Housing and Urban Development Administration and the Economic Development Administration. And then the last one there includes continued calls for federal programs to increase support for communities to mitigate against the impacts of increased freight movement, including more transparent and regularly updated information on grade crossing delays, and a prioritization within new programs like the Railroad Crossing Elimination Program, which is currently open now, to focus on communities that are seeing those increased delays and congestion and environmental impacts due to increased freight traffic. So with that, we'll turn it over to Kasha to go over the state agenda, and then we'll be here to take any questions or feedback you may have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kasha Hart, and I'm also a senior with our Legislative Affairs team. It's good to be with you all. So the draft state agenda is broken out into the same categories as our federal agenda, and we're trying to align with our strategic direction. We also have some similar subcategories between the state and federal agendas as well. So beginning with transportation, transportation finance and funding reform has been a long-standing Cmap priority, and the report that Cmap has been directed to do by the General Assembly in coordination with the RTA on kind of the future of transit funding in the region is going to continue to inform how these specific recommendations evolve over time. We also know that there is a lot more that we need to do to make our streets safer for all roadway users. And as Cmap continues to grow our Safe and Complete Streets body of work, you will see in our agenda we have more items related to promoting traffic safety and improving access to safe walking and cycling infrastructure. So finally, transportation innovation and transparency have also been consistently part of our agendas, which is particularly important given that the Regional Planning Act sort of dictates us to be the data hub for the region. And this year, we're really thinking about this through the lens of federal funding and making sure that we're instituting performance-based planning and project selection measures for IIJA-funded investments. So moving on now to our climate section on the state side, not only has integrated water resources management been a key part of Cmap's advocacy agenda for some time, but this is really an issue that touches every single community in our region, whether it's flooding, water quality issues, water supply, or some combination of those. And this is also a space in where there are a number of regional solutions that we can pursue, and a lack of investment can really yield some significant health and economic consequences. Additionally, we have a section here focused on reducing emissions from the transportation sector. And this in part discusses new federal requirements around measuring on-road GHG emissions and thinking about how we can be strategic in developing some parallel state processes as we're already needing to set up these frameworks. And this is also about ensuring we see successful implementation of CEJA and making sure that local governments are supported in their role to reduce emissions and also build a clean energy workforce. Finally, regional economic competitiveness. So as with transportation and climate, many of the items included in this section are really based on ODGE 2050 and the plan update. This section in particular does look to build upon some of the previous specific bodies of research that Cmap has undertaken in previous years. So for example, Cmap's local development incentives report included a number of recommendations around improving access to development incentive data, which is an important first step to assess the impact that these programs are having in our region. Additionally, we've included a couple of recommendations in this section from our fares, fees, and fines report, as they are complementary to some of the Safe and Complete Streets recommendations that we have in our transportation section focused on increasing traffic safety enforcement. So with that, I think I'm now going to hand it back to John to talk through some of our next steps.
Thanks, Kasha. Thank you, Tim. We've been through this process. We're getting near the end right now. We've met with all the committees at this point of Cmap and with the various divisions of the organization, of the agency. We're still accepting comments. We welcome your comments and suggestions. We will be presenting the draft advocacy agendas to the board in November. And we will be seeking final approval at the January meeting. So in the meantime, if you have comments or suggestions, please forward them to us and we will incorporate them. Thanks for your attention to this.
When do you want the comments by?
Well, we'd like it sometime soon. We're pretty close to being complete. So I would say sometime in the month of October, if we can have that done through October, we'd be in good shape.
Thank you. And where should we email them? That's a good question.
To me, Jay Carpenter at cmap.illinois.gov or to Tim or Kasha.
If you go to the next slide too, Brian, our contact information is on the next slide.
Right.
There you go.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. Are there any other questions for the legislative folks? Go ahead, Tom.
If we had interest in seeking support for an additional piece of state legislation related to climate equity, how would we go about pursuing that?
I would suggest you send that suggestion and those comments and that information to Kasha.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah,
appreciate that.
Great.
Yeah. Call Ash.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, hearing none. Thanks, John, Kasha, and Tim for that presentation. We are now going to move on to keeping up with this. Thanks, Brian. We're now going to move on to our next agenda item, which is a presentation on Cmap's Climate Resilience Work Plan. And I believe I'm going to be handing it over to Kate Avasic to present the next section. Take it away, Kate.
Thank you, Chair Dernbaugh, and good morning, everyone. Alexis McAdams and Kelsey Pudlock are joining me here today, and we're excited to have the opportunity to present to the committee about our climate resilience strategy. I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction into the strategy, and then Kelsey, Alexis, and I are going to walk through our slate of projects so that really you come away with an understanding of our portfolio, and hopefully we can identify some synergies with your work and other efforts that are happening in the region so that we can work together on these challenges. Next slide. So enhancing climate resilience is one of 3 areas in Cmap's approach towards climate, along with reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which you heard about at the May committee meeting, and sustainably managing water resources, which you will hear about at a future meeting. And on the next slide, our resilience work is directly influenced by the 3 principles of ON to 2050. If you could advance to the next slide, please. Resilience is the most straightforward. This is to help communities tackle the extreme weather challenges that we're faced with today while considering potential future conditions in planning, engineering, and other actions. We need to make sure that what and where we build today will keep people out of harm's way and continue to meet its intended purpose for decades to come. And equally important is the need to preserve and enhance our natural resources that provide many benefits, including protection against climate change. Inclusive growth is an overarching goal of our resilience work. The fact is that extreme weather and the effects of climate change do not affect all people equally. Some communities suffer first and worst due to a history of marginalization, being overburdened by pollution, and receiving a lack of investment in infrastructure, housing, transportation, and healthcare. So advancing inclusive growth or equity in our climate work is really crucial to address these historic and ongoing inequities that are faced by our communities. And with the infrastructure bill, we're really given significant funding to be able to make it happen in the shorter term. And finally, we know that the needs of our communities far exceed the available funds. For example, even with this historic influx in federal funding for climate resilience, it's not enough to upgrade all of the infrastructure that needs to be brought up to date. But by using a data-driven approach, we can understand how climate change and extreme weather will impact our communities in the region, use that information to prioritize the highest needs, and identify areas to coordinate investments across jurisdictions to maximize benefits of our investments. On the next slide, I want to talk a bit about how our resilience work reaches across the main functions of the agency through our land use and transportation planning activities, through activities like open space conservation and conducting vulnerability assessments. We're seeking to improve the resilience of our communities and transportation systems. We support resilience by analyzing and sharing data related to climate hazards and providing guidance to shape policy decisions around public and private investments. Because climate change touches nearly every facet of life, we facilitate coordination across jurisdictions and agencies to understand the challenges, identify opportunities, and seek out those solutions that we can work on together. And then finally, we're including resilience as a scoring criteria in our transportation funding programs. And this is to encourage and incentivize transportation projects that reduce impacts like flooding and extreme heat. So on the next slide, this is our slate of resilience projects that we're going to step through. And then at the end, we want to reserve time, of course, for your questions and facilitate some discussion. So jumping right into it, the first project that I want to highlight is the Regional Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan. Next slide, please. This is a significant project that'll help us access federal dollars for resilience improvements. It'll help us integrate resilience into the agency's core transportation functions and direct our resilience work really for years to come. The objective of this project is to develop a data-driven understanding of transportation system vulnerability to climate change and extreme weather, and then to support integrating climate resilience into transportation decision-making. Next slide. This work builds on action at the federal and the regional level to promote climate resilience in transportation planning and programming, from transportation authorization bills and the federal infrastructure bill, which increases funding for transportation resilience, as well as previous plans in our region that have focused on extreme weather impacts to transportation. Next slide. This is important because historically we've looked at past weather to plan for the future, but we know it's increasingly important to look at possible future conditions by considering temperature and precipitation projections. The fact is that major transportation and stormwater assets that are built or reconstructed today will be lasting for decades. So it's important to ensure that they can withstand both current and future conditions. Next slide. This work will help position the region to take advantage of new formula and competitive funding from the federal infrastructure bill. Specifically, Protect and the Healthy Streets programs are new. Protect will fund transportation resilience improvements and planning, and will direct $250 million in formula funding to the state of Illinois over 5 years. Healthy Streets, this is a grant program. It's going to dedicate $500 million to stormwater, heat, and air quality projects, with an emphasis on those funds going to underserved and disadvantaged communities. And I also want to note that the infrastructure bill increases funding and eligibility for existing transportation programs. So the Surface Transportation Block Grant, which is known as STP in our region, this is now able to fund resilience improvements that are tied to transportation projects. And Illinois is set to experience or see a 23% increase in formula funds from this program. And then finally, the National Highway Performance Program is allowing up to 15% of funds to go to resilience projects. And the funds of this program are increasing as well by 18%. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about vulnerability. And really, to build resilience, you need to first understand vulnerability. The vulnerability of a transportation asset or system is based on its exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So what do we mean by this? Exposure refers to whether an asset is located in an area that's experiencing a climate impact. Sensitivity refers to how the asset fares when exposed to a climate variable. And then finally, adaptive capacity refers to the system's ability to then cope with existing or future climate impacts. So just to give an example, a bridge might be located in an area that's expected to experience an increase in flooding. But of course, if that bridge is designed to withstand the increased level of flooding, it's going to have low vulnerability. On the next slide is another important measure of resilience, which is looking at criticality. So these are the criteria and the weights that the Houston MPO used to measure criticality of its transportation system, specifically roads and bridges. And criticality really measures the importance of a transportation asset related to its use and operation, socioeconomic importance, health and safety, and emergency preparedness. So it's really a measure that can help capture the important function of a transportation asset to users, and as well as its role in providing equitable service. On the next slide is an example of what these results can look like. So the assessment will result in GIS data and ultimately some sort of interactive dashboard or map. If you could advance to the next slide, please. These are the results from Houston's assessment, where they assessed roads and bridges, road and bridge vulnerability to flooding, and then they combined the vulnerability and the criticality scores to get an overall picture of which assets were both highly vulnerable and highly critical, and those are shown here in red and orange. They created this dashboard. It's an ArcGIS online product to share the results, and so it's interactive, so you can click on a road segment like I did here to pull up some information about it, including the underlying data of the criticality scores and the vulnerability scores. Next slide. The end goal of this work is really to make sure that the results are used to advance resilience and transportation decision-making at Cmap and all of the roadway and transit agencies across the region. We will be folding the assessment results into a transportation resilience improvement plan that outlines priority improvement areas and strategies for incorporating resilience into all areas of transportation, planning, management, policy. And as Tim mentioned earlier, this plan will really help the region become fully eligible to receive and compete for PROTECT program funds. And you know, specifically for Cmap, this plan could recommend new regional performance measures and targets that we can use to track progress on increasing resilience, as well as improved resilience criteria for scoring projects for federal funding. So now I'm going to pass it over to Kelsey Pudlock to talk about the Flood Susceptibility Index.
Thanks, Kate, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk to you about the Flood Susceptibility Index update. This is a project which is partly funded by a Senate earmark, and it kicked off earlier this month, and we're aiming to update the index within a year's time. So before I get into what that will entail, I first want to offer a little bit of background on the initial susceptibility index work that we did back in 2018. So rewind 4 years from this point in time, and we developed an index for both urban and riverine flooding, specifically to attempt to identify priority areas across the region that could benefit from more targeted stormwater planning and flood mitigation activities. So the indexes scored susceptibility on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being least susceptible and 10 being the most susceptible. And these scores are based on the relationship between reported flood locations and a set of flood-related factors. So at the time, 2 indexes were created, given that the causes and contributing factors associated with urban and riverine flooding are often different. And these differences are reflected in the geography and the set of factors that were used to create each index. Next slide, please. So just wanted to give an example here. The urban FSI scored the developed areas outside of the 100-year floodplain using 6 flood-related factors, all of which are aiming to capture landscape, weather, and infrastructure characteristics that essentially influence urban flooding. So all 6 factors used within this index are listed here on the right. And some of these were also used within the riverine, but the last 3 that have been listed were unique to the urban index itself. So just to get into this a little bit, the precipitation variation, this was selected because it's identifying a storm event that has a lot of connection to common infrastructure design standards for local drainage systems. And so this is likely to contribute to urban flooding. And then we looked at elevation differential with the base flood elevation, because this is likely to be identifying areas that are to experience basement flooding, that these are areas that are near the floodplain, but outside and low-lying areas that the Cook County Hazard Mitigation Plan identified that this was a trend, that these areas often experience basement flooding. So trying to capture different types of flooding that occur. And then the last one, topography, or the topographic wetness index. This is a factor that's trying to identify those flat areas where water is likely to pond, and especially if a sewer network has reached its capacity during a flooding event. So in the 4 years that the indexes have been available, next slide, please. They've been used in a number of different ways. So I can say Cmap has used it for our local planning projects to identify where flooding and stormwater issues are occurring and should be addressed through our local plans. And then a partner of ours, Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, has manipulated the urban FSI and has used it within their own stormwater master planning work. And then nonprofits like the Nature Conservancy have also used the urban FSI as a factor within their green print mapping tool that helps prioritize areas that could benefit from open space expansion or green infrastructure opportunities. So recognizing that this has been a really valuable data set and tool for our partners, we want to ensure that it can continue to be relevant and useful to their work. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we also recognize, though, it's been 4 years, and as time passes, we know that some of the flood-related factors are becoming outdated, and we also know that there's just generally room for improvement with all of the work that we do. So through this update, we're looking to refine the methodology and then the underlying data with the hope and expectation that it will lead to a more accurate understanding of regional flood risk, both now and into the future. So to expand on this a little bit more, we used the methodology previously that was fairly simplistic. So we want to explore if a different and more sophisticated approach will identify new risk areas. We are also exploring whether there's a need for two indexes. We certainly know that the urban FSI has been more widely used over the years. So should we focus our efforts on the urban version? And if so, is there even a way in which we can capture both urban and riverine in one index? We also recognize that the data that we used, the reported flood location data, is very much biased towards residential flooding. And so is there a way that we can expand this data set to capture a broader range of land use types, and then again, our understanding of where flood risk is occurring. And then finally, I want to make sure that we're capturing the most up-to-date and relevant flood-related factors. And to this end, we're particularly interested in this time around of figuring out how we might incorporate climate projection data to help us see how flood risk will shift into the future. And so as we evaluate and consider the different ways we can improve our work from 2018, we'll be engaging with partners and decision makers to gather insights as users of the data, and then as well as to ensure that any updates we make are still relevant and sound and advantageous to their work. So please stay tuned, and as we make strides on this project, we look forward to involving some of you along the way as users of the index, as well as just getting to know how our partners' work can inform this effort moving forward. So thank you. I'll turn it back over to Kate.
Thanks, Kelsey. The next project is focused on understanding who is disproportionately impacted by flooding and developing guidance for stormwater agencies and others on how to make their investments more equitable and reduce the disproportionate impacts that are being exacerbated by climate change. This is using the same funding that Kelsey mentioned. It's a one-year project funded by a Senate earmark. And there's three core, I would say, focus areas of this work. Engagement is a significant focus, both by understanding the practices, barriers, and opportunities from the perspectives of county and large municipal stormwater agencies, as well as the equally important perspectives and information and insights of community partners who represent communities that are disproportionately impacted by flooding and climate change. Second, we'll be looking at data used to identify the communities that are impacted most by flooding and therefore should be prioritized for improvements that can reduce burdens and maximize benefits. And finally, we'll be developing a short guide to help stormwater agencies apply an equity lens to their decision-making processes, including practices for stakeholder engagement, removing barriers to apply for assistance, criteria used in prioritizing projects, and other areas. Next slide, please. This work is important, particularly for a region where urban flooding and sewer backups in basements are pervasive and getting worse, and at a time when there are levels of funding that haven't been seen before in decades. So partners around the region have been working to shine a light on urban flooding and inequities, including the Center for Neighborhood Technology, which conducted a study in the city of Chicago that found that 87% of flood damage insurance claims were paid in communities of color. Acknowledging the inequities faced by many communities, the White House's Justice 40 initiative establishes a commitment to provide at least 40% of the benefits from federal climate investments to communities that are currently and historically marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. So we hope that this work can build on these previous efforts to examine how communities are disproportionately impacted across the region, help translate federal guidance around equitable investments, and incorporate local perspectives on the unique challenges and opportunities that we're presented with in Northeastern Illinois. Next slide, please. Just to give some context for the data portion of this work, for the ONTO 2050 plan, Cmap developed 2 data layers to identify priority areas for inclusive growth. The economically disconnected areas, or EDA layer, is shown here in yellow, and it's based on census data on race, ethnicity, income, and linguistic isolation to identify areas that are potentially not well connected to regional economic progress. We also, for ONTO 2050, mapped commercial and industrial areas that are shown in blue, which are defined as disinvested based on employment, lending, and real estate data. And in green is where these areas overlap. Next slide, please. When we developed the Flood Susceptibility Index that Kelsey explained, we then compared the index with this data on economically disconnected and disinvested areas. So this graph shows flood susceptibility along the x-axis and acres along the y-axis. And you can see in purple how acres of disinvested and economically disconnected areas increases as you move from less susceptibility to more susceptible, meaning that these areas may experience greater flood risk. Whereas for the rest of the region, which is shown in the green bars, this decreases, meaning that these areas may experience less flood risk. And I'll just note here that the results are summarized for the entire region, and the relationship we found does vary by county, and it's more significant in Cook, Kane, and Lake. On the next slide, please. This is the data that we have been working with over the past few years, but we know that it doesn't capture all of the potential driving factors behind flooding inequities. So this project will allow us to look at other factors that have been used to identify underserved and overburdened communities. It'll allow us to refine layers to identify high flood risk, such as using the Flood Susceptibility Index and others, and then incorporate community knowledge to ensure that the areas that currently experience environmental justice or flood equity concerns are captured as well. So now I'm going to hand it over to Alexis McAdams, who's going to talk to us about the Heat Vulnerability Index.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kate. My name is Alexis McAdams. I'm a research analyst in the Research and Innovation Group here at Cmap. And I'm going to just be providing a quick overview of the Heat Vulnerability Index work. So the Heat Vulnerability Index is a project that aims to create or build a methodology to identify areas of elevated heat or elevated risk during periods of high heat. So as many of you know, and as Kate outlined earlier, heat waves will be increasing in frequency and intensity in the future due to climate change. Heat vulnerability indices are just one type of tool that we can use to help plan for this eventual future. So just a quick note, this work builds off of the efforts of many in the remote sensing, emergency management, and public health communities, without whom this kind of analysis isn't possible. Cmap is just one of many partners around the region that are currently working on this topic. And though different research groups may have different methods, goals, and areas of focus, we're pleased to be in contact with a number of folks who are looking at this issue and working towards a more resilient region. Next slide, please. So the Heat Vulnerability Index approach uses a similar framework as the Transportation Resilience Plan, where vulnerability is defined as a combination of 3 elements: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptability. The first step in our analysis is looking at exposure, or the physical aspects of heat. This includes not only high temperatures, but also how our environment holds or releases heat, which is commonly understood as the urban heat island effect. So to demonstrate that concept, let's take a look at an area with a lot of paved surface area. I pulled a satellite imagery look at O'Hare Airport, which is on the left-hand side of this image. And then to the east, you can see the Des Plaines River and some forest preserve land. When we overlay surface temperature data provided by the Landsat satellite imagery program, next slide, or one click, we can see that the surface temperatures recorded for these areas on a hot day in July can differ by as much as 50 degrees. So Landsat satellite temperature data is just one input that we're using for looking at exposure. Now, surface temperature isn't quite the same as air temperature. It doesn't include things like humidity, so that kind of like real field temperature that you get on really hot, humid days. So we're also looking at tying in observed weather data and National Weather Service heat warning data as part of the inputs to understand exposure for heat in our region. Once we're finally through looking at this element, we'll be combining multiple days and years of data to provide a summarized look at which areas across the region capture and hold heat more than others. Next slide, please. So the next element to our analysis is looking at sensitivity, and that involves quantifying and locating sensitive populations. Medical and public health research has already done a lot of the heavy lifting here to identify these folks and these populations that tend to have adverse outcomes in heat waves. But I do want to make a note that these populations aren't inherently at risk from high heat, but it tends to be an outcome of the lack of the right resources or the right policy to help these populations handle high heat events when they come along. So to that end, we're looking at census ACS data to identify these populations, combined with our land use inventory to better understand where these at-risk populations may be across the region. And this is really important for areas that have a lot of open space or agricultural land that it's important to take note of, but when we're looking at vulnerability of populations, we want to know where the people are. So we plan on doing individual analyses for each county, as well as region-wide, to better identify local risk in heat waves relative to neighboring communities. Next slide, please. So finally, the last element of this analysis will be looking at adaptability, which describes strategies to cope with high heat in the short term, as well as adapting to high heat in the long term. Short-term strategies include things like upgrading home air conditioning, having cooling centers open and available, and long-term strategies include things like forestry strategies for your area to increase tree canopy, or having an updated heat response plan for your community. This element is the most difficult to identify and quantify, especially at the local level, and there's often some overlap with the other two elements, exposure and sensitivity. So we're still bouncing ideas around and figuring out how we're going to quantify this element. We're looking for input from our community partners, and we're also balancing this with access to the data that we already have. So TBD. Next slide, please. So putting these elements together into some kind of summarized score will give us a heat vulnerability index, and we're still deciding what that is going to look like, whether it's something like a score from 1 to 5 or categories, or even a score from 1 to 10, similar to the flood susceptibility index. But when we're finished, one of our major goals is to make this information available via an interactive web map, on top of making the input data, methodology, and the code used to construct the index available as well. So the work is continuing, and we're looking forward to seeing how we can support and supplement partner efforts across the region for a better understanding of heat. And I'll turn it back over to Kate, I believe. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis. So just one more slide on the last project that I want to touch on, and this is an internal project to integrate resilience into our local planning practices. So you just heard about the resilience-related tools and data that we're developing. the heat vulnerability index, the flood susceptibility index, and flood equity layers. This work is really going to help bring those resources into our local planning work. As you know, we work across many communities in the region, and we work on a variety of plans, all of which can incorporate resilience elements. So this work is going to identify, what resources are available for project managers and project teams within Cmap. It'll identify what changes need to be made to internal processes to address resilience, and then update an existing climate guide that was developed through a NOAA-funded project a few years ago in collaboration with the American Planning Association and the Illinois State Climatologists. So this project resulted in a guidebook. I have the front cover of the guidebook on this slide. And it was really geared at practitioners across the Great Lakes region on how to incorporate climate information into planning efforts. And it highlights case studies where Cmap piloted the approach in 4 projects in the region. So we're excited about the process to internalize all of these data and tools and make sure that we're putting them to good use in all of the planning work that takes place here. So that concludes our overview. And we have discussion questions, and we also expect that you have questions specifically about the projects as well. And so we welcome all of those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate and Kelsey and Alexis, for that rich presentation. I'll open it up to members of the committee for any questions you might have. Cynthia?
Yeah, I'm interested in the incorporation of conversations surrounding focusing on local and relying more on our local farms and, keeping things more localized in as a tool to mitigate climate change. And that also brings in transportation issues as well. With corridors going through even McHenry County with, a transportation of food, et cetera, going back to this focus of supporting local communities. I'm on the board of a food cooperative we're building in McHenry County. So we're looking at that as a contribution to sustainability in this area. So just kind of broadly speaking, and also the incorporation of conversations surrounding the health of our watersheds and how that is incorporated into these plans and conversations. Thanks for anybody.
Cynthia, so you were specifically asking how we are thinking about incorporating local efforts. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like relying more on our local food systems, growing food for people, lessening that carbon footprint from transporting foods from distant areas. And how that, if that's incorporated into this conversation, it seems like it kind of touches on everything: transportation, climate change, and other issues of concern, economic development.
Yeah, I'll start by just saying that, local food was a focus of the Go to 2040 plan. It has been less of a focus in recent years and is not reflected in our resilience work. But if I could punt to anyone else over at Cmap who would like to elaborate a little bit more on that. What you got me thinking about, Cynthia, was just, as we're planning regionally, as you know, most of these projects are regionally focused projects. We are continuously trying to figure out how we can incorporate local participation, local data to really help ground the work that we're doing. So that was just one thing that came to mind more generally based on your comment. Brian?
Yeah, I can also chime in and say that while some of I think the question about sort of how we focus on localism as a potential, resilience strategy is a really good one. Like Kate said, the sort of food systems work that Cmap has done in the past has, I would say, been passed by some other priorities in our strategic vision, but we do certainly want to encourage action on promoting local food systems among our partners. And I know I personally have been contacted about several different ongoing efforts focused on local food right now. And I'd be happy to share some information with you, Cynthia, if you're interested in participating. The American Farmland Trust has a new report out called Farms Under Threat that's focused on land conservation, agricultural land conservation strategies. And they have different strategies targeted to different regions and states, including Illinois. So they've been convening Illinois partners to talk about that. There's also been a potential effort kind of bubbling up through some action with the Illinois Association of Regional Councils to try to kind of advance that similar kinds of strategies. I'm not sure where that stands right now, but this is definitely part of the conversation in the region right now, even if it's not something Cmap is quite as directly working on.
Thanks, Brian. It looks like we have a number of hands up, so I'll call them out in order that I see them on my screen. So Reed, I think you have your hand up.
Thank you. Great presentation. One thing on the discussion question that you have here regarding resilience programs, just something to consider that's becoming more common than government-based cooling centers or emergency centers are the community resilience hubs that I don't think Chicago or the surrounding area has, but it's becoming more common because there's an issue of trust, and with the community, you know, when you compare them to government cooling centers, you know, folded chairs in a gymnasium really isn't going to make someone sit there for 4 hours to cool off. So looking into that, or at least helping to promote that with government supporting them instead of recreating the wheel. That's one thing. Regarding Alexis, hopefully Cmap can attend a research sharing or you know, what's the latest in heat vulnerability indices that are being built. Argonne and Discovery Partners Institute has a prototype of an HVI where they used health data. And one of the things that I think is important to look at is how we can define or identify these vulnerable communities and using health data because of the risks associated with heat. The preliminary or prototype HVI is now looking in the Chicago area as high blood pressure as one of the highest risks. In New York, it was congestive heart failure. So in addition to race and ethnicity, I think looking at these health risks that impact the HVI, we're undergoing this with looking at death certificates, looking at excess deaths at 80 degrees or higher, just like what New York did. And that's how they're identifying vulnerability. So hopefully, Alexis, we can have you present what you did in this like meeting of researchers to see all the different HVIs that are being developed. I think you mentioned that a whole bunch of people are developing HVIs. So which one should we use? And there's some, I don't want to call it disagreement, but should we use Landsat or MODIS? You know, the surface temperature. Sometimes you exchange granularity for frequency. I think we used MODIS satellite so we can get twice daily input, but it's at 1 kilometer versus the Landsat, which is finer detail. So, but you could miss extreme heat events with that. I think it's once every 2 weeks, the Landsat. I don't know if you're planning to use the latest Landsat too, and I don't know when it goes online. But I just wanted to throw that out there, Alexis, because I know there's a lot of emails being volleyed back and forth. I have tried to email a couple of times, so I don't mean to fill your inbox, but I hope that you can join us too. And regarding the presentation on the FSI, Kelsey, it is part of one of many indicators we use, PM 2.5, flooding, traffic. surface temperature, asthma, to identify where priority communities would benefit most with tree planting initiatives. So I'll leave it at that and hope to talk to you later after this meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Reed, for adding that into the minutes, the comment about use of the FSI. There was 2 notes in the chat for you, Reed. One was Deborah Stone commenting that she's working with some local communities on resilience hubs. And then Edith, I don't know, I can turn it over to you, I suppose, since you're next up with your hand, but you can also ask for additional detail on the community resilience hub.
Yeah, Reed, I just wanted a little more, if you could just better explain the approach of the Community Resilience Hub, particularly for heat vulnerability.
One of the things that we've seen, I think it was New York, and I forget the other cities that are doing this, where you take existing community infrastructure, whether it's a community center or a community-based organization that has an area where it's not specifically for heat vulnerability, it's designed. I think the one example I was reading, it was in The Guardian, I can share in the chat here, I'll look it up, where they play video games, or you can, I think it was like knitting lessons, but it's a cool area. So there's sometimes that the way government approaches resiliency hubs, it's almost like you're embarrassed to go in them. So they redesign them so that there's other activities and resources that are within these hubs, and they happen to be a cooler area. So you don't just sit in a folded chair and, you know, that's what people are expecting of government. I doubt there's lounge chairs or TVs or activities planned within cooling centers, which doesn't make any sense, because I think if you look at human-centered design, why would anyone just want to sit in an uncomfortable area? And you can see them, they're not heavily utilized. So expanding that definition of a resource hub or resilience, a community hub, to providing more than just a cooling center. I think that's generally, but I'll put that article where they explain some of these examples.
Thank you. And am I up next?
Yep, go ahead, Edith.
Great. Thanks. And then Reed, if I could just challenge you a little bit. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the government approach, other than if that example of having folding chairs in a gymnasium is the only one we have, that's a problem. But it's possible for an agency, a public agency like a park district that may offer knitting lessons and video gaming groups anyway, it's possible, I guess, for the public sector to be more participatory in appealing cooling centers. So I'm just making that a little bit more of a statement. And then my question for Cmap staff, congratulations on the FSI update and the HVI, really excited to see that work. Could you talk a little bit more about assistance that might be available for communities, particularly in the heat response planning that Alexis had mentioned, and both technical assistance potentially from Cmap, as well as if there's any federal funding that might flow down to communities for that heat emergency response planning and action, either through IIJA or IRA?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Unfortunately, I can't really comment too much on the funding availability part of things. I'm kind of more just the data jockey, working on putting this, the more technical parts of the analysis together. But I'll leave the floor open if anyone else in the room from Cmap would like to comment.
Yeah, Edith, the Healthy Streets program is specifically coming to mind. There's funding to do specifically, I think it was tree assessments. And so you could do an assessment planning level activity to identify areas where tree plantings would be most needed, and potentially other interventions too to reduce heat. So I think that's an avenue. Again, that's a national grant program, but we could certainly look at potential interest, and what's coming to mind is you would want to pull together assessments probably for several municipalities to make it worthwhile to go after.
And, you know, I'll just say, and potentially someone else may want to jump in after this, that, you know, we are continuously trying to broaden our funding reach. You heard about from the Legislative Affairs team, our efforts to increase our funding capacity to be able to take on all of the planning that we are to do. And that applies to our climate work as well. So we were really thankful to get Senate earmark money so that we were able to update the FSI and do this work on flood equity. And that's going to continue to be a focus of our efforts to figure out how we're able to broaden beyond, you know, what we're able to do with our transportation funding.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Elena.
Hi, everyone. I have a question and a comment, and I'm not sure if there's still possibility for updating, but I think one thing that I've seen kind of missing in some vulnerability assessments is both looking at social connectedness and mental health. And the, you know, there are some existing tools that you could use, which is one is BRFIS, CDC's behavioral risk factor surveillance systems. They ask a couple like self-identifying questions about both mental health and social connectedness. As you know, those are both key factors in vulnerability to all the climate disasters. So that's something to think about when the possibility arises again for updating. And then my question is, are you incorporating or seeking out local thoughts in the communities where, you know, once there's the communities that are identified as being most vulnerable, are you seeking out any, you know, what are the people who actually live in those areas, what do they see as what might be threats to their community as it relates to heat, as it relates to flooding?
Yeah, so we're definitely doing that for the flood equity project, where we'll be convening community-based organizations and getting feedback on impacts of flooding, and information that can help influence the type of data that we're using to help identify communities. Heat is an area where we're focused on the heat vulnerability index right now, but the logical next step is to then do similar work and, you know, really draw from the work that you're doing at UIC and that the city of Chicago is doing and other partners that Alexis mentioned. So yeah, I think that's a really great point.
Thanks so much. And now, Marcella, I believe you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. My question / comment is about the greenhouse gas indicator dashboard. So I believe it said an 80% reduction by 2050, and I'm not sure what the percentage would calculate to for the 2025 goal or how we're doing with that. Well, I guess, yeah, we can kind of see it there a little bit. But we need to get to net zero by 2050, basically. So 20% is kind of a big gap from that. And I know that, you know, obviously the region is large and there are certain things that can't be accounted for, you know, through, you know, electrification or other things, but those are somewhat smaller pieces of the puzzle. If we can reduce and get to net zero with transportation and buildings, will be most of the way there. And I'm just stating that based on the most recent IPCC reports that say that net zero is kind of the tipping point at 2050 to avoid the worst of climate change impacts. So I'm wondering if Cmap would consider revising that goal that's perhaps a little outdated at this point.
Thanks, Marcella. Is there anyone from Cmap that'd like to respond to that or how it might incorporate into the revision of onto 2050?
Hi, Marcella. I can take a stab at it. I think we've been thinking about updating the indicator, and generally all signs are pointing to a net zero 2050 goal, especially when we see the recent proposed rulemaking from the Biden administration where our transportation system would need to get to net zero by that time period. So we are definitely actively exploring that, and we have a regional transportation emission reduction planning project that's just launching to investigate that further and identify both the targets and the reduction strategies needed for the region.
Thanks, Nora.
Thanks so much, Nora. And it looks like Deborah has her hand up.
So I'll do this real quick if you'll indulge me. Just one more comment on the resilience hubs idea. Echoing Edith, I think it's not so much where the facility is located, public or private, as who's in the driver's seat in saying where it should be. And, you know, the example I think about is maybe Cook County should move away from designating the Markham Courthouse as the cooling center, because a tremendous amount of energy goes into trying to reach people during a crisis to tell them where to go. And it's not necessarily a place they really want to go necessarily. So if you work with them ahead of time, maybe it's a public library, maybe it's a community college or a church or a nonprofit, but maybe that's where you put the backup generators and the battery and the, you know, the solar power and the spare water. And then as people go there on a day-to-day basis, they learn ahead of time that that's where they can go in an emergency. So that's kind of the way I think about it.
Thanks so much. Any additional comment on that? Any other questions or responses to the discussion prompts that we have in front of us from any members of the committee? Okay, hearing none. Thanks so much. That was a very rich conversation on the resilience work. Again, Kate, Kelsey, and Alexis, thanks so much for the hard work you're doing, and look forward to seeing that continue and some of the outcomes or outputs from some of that work going forward. Moving on, our next item on our agenda is committee member updates. We have had 2 requests for updates, so I will call out members of the committee to share the updates that they suggested. I believe Marcella Bondi Keenan from the Village of Oak Park had an update for the committee.
Oh, sure. So I'm excited to say that the Village of Oak Park adopted our comprehensive sustainability and climate plan, which does set a goal for net zero by 2050 and a 60% reduction by 2030, as well as 30% of land protected for biodiversity by 2030. And we also declared a climate emergency. And we're looking at directing 40% of our public sustainability and climate dollars towards more vulnerable community members. And of course, you know, always partnering to co-create programs and policies. Just wanted to share that with the group.
Thank you, Marcella. Elena, I think you had also offered up an update for the committee.
Yeah, 2 updates. One is at UIC School of Public Health in partnership with Edith and 4 other municipalities. We are starting a Climate and Health Institute where students are both learning how to better prepare for the health effects from climate change, and then also working with municipalities in doing something about it. And then there might be some other people on this call that are part of another grant that was awarded to Argonne, UIC, Northwestern. It's a really large grant called Crocus, Community Research on Climate and Urban Science. And it's looking at microclimates and how climate change is impacting at the neighborhood level. And they're looking at working with 3 environmental justice communities in the city of Chicago and ensuring that there's, understanding of how to use the data that's collected by community members and how they can use it to advocate on behalf of themselves. So it's a really exciting, both are really exciting projects that will hopefully help build resilience in our area.
Thanks, Elena, and congratulations. Moving on, other business. Is there any other new business to come before the committee? Hearing none, we'll move on to our next item, which is our public comment. I'll turn it over to staff to read any comments that they received prior to today's meeting. And if anyone was requested to be recognized at this point, I will allow staff to manage the public comment period.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Just as a reminder, if any attendees would like to address the committee, they can please indicate so in the chat box. I see one hand up, so Garland, we'll hear from you in just a minute. We did not receive any comments prior to today's meeting. I will take a minute to just acknowledge that I know we did have a little bit of a inconsistency in the links that we sent out for this meeting, so I wanted to apologize for that. I think people were mostly able to find us, but we will do our best to make sure we don't have the same problem next time. I also just wanted to take a minute. I think we covered many of the items that people put into the chat over the course of the meeting, but we got a couple of members who arrived late letting us know that they had joined. The roll call now reflects that, so thank you. We had, during the FSI presentation, Reed pointed out that CDPH uses the FSI as one of the indicators to identify priority communities for tree planting to improve urban canopy. And Kelsey thanked him for that. He also shared that they are hoping to get Cmap's input on their plan for a public health-based HVI. Marcella asked about the 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas reduction goals, and Nora provided a link to the current indicator. We had some discussion of the community resilience hubs, which was great, which we also had verbally. Alexis noted that the detailed health risk factors are missing from our analysis, and that's a drawback from our approach, but is glad that someone in Northeastern Illinois is looking into it. And Reed shared a link to the Guardian article on heat resilience centers, and another link to the recent project award for working on extreme weather, heat and flooding. And then Elena noted that there's a lot of research showing stigma about going to cooling centers, so rethinking and reimagining them is a great idea. Edith also shared a link to the emission reduction targets in the climate action plan for the Chicago region. Alex Ensign of Cmap staff congratulated Marcella on the Oak Park plan. Edith mentioned that the 4 municipalities working at the Climate and Health Institute are Waukegan, Aurora, Chicago Heights, and Hanover Park. And Marcella noted to Edith that the regional plan makes a good point that innovation is needed to address the remaining 20% in the greenhouse target, and that the IPCC indicates that the net zero goal is, in a sense, non-negotiable. Edith also shared an announcement on the Crocus program. Thank you for your patience while I read out your chats. That's just something we have to do to get everything into the public record. But I am available to do dramatic readings and Zoom chats from any of your meetings if that's a service you're looking for. So with that, I'd like to ask if anyone joining by phone, potentially from Des Moines, Iowa, would like to make a comment.
Thanks, Brian and Aaron. How you doing out there in the Chicagoland area?
Good to see you, Garland.
Thanks. And I just want to comment on especially what you're saying. I want to give kudos to y'all and also making sure for the ADA to understand about it, because with the climate changes and the health is most important of all, and they need to make sure that the disability community will not be left out of it, because there are some and especially seniors who are disabled too. They need to know about it, because sometimes their health is most important of all with the climate changes. So we need to make sure from all different walks of life in the disability community, even seniors too, so that they can make sure what what they could do to be extremely well prepared for this, because sometimes, God forbids, that we don't want, like what's happening right now in Florida, like Hurricane Iona. We want to make sure that the ADA and the seniors too to be extremely well prepared for this, because God forbids, we don't want no one to be dying again. So that's the most important of all, how to get this and make sure that the disability community have a clear understanding of it, and they cannot procrastinate and be extremely well prepared for this. So we need to somehow educate them so that they'll understand this is a real one and it's coming to them whether they like it or not, because time will tell, and God forbids that I said, like we told you so, and it's definitely affecting them and they cannot deny it or anything. So we need to make sure about how to get this extremely well prepared for the communities and the disability communities, and make sure to translate in different languages so that they can be well prepared for future advances. And the next generation will say why the previous generation was not extremely well prepared for this. So they need to understand and how to get it well prepared and get this going, because we don't want to lose another life, especially in a situation like this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Garland. That's a great call to action. For anyone who's curious about some of the work Cmap is doing on ADA and accessibility right now, there was a great presentation to the Regional Economy Committee yesterday. That video will be up on our YouTube. I'm sure that presentation will come before many of our boards and committees, but if anyone's curious, that's a great place to start. And I believe that there appear to be no other individuals wishing to address the committee at this time.
Thank you, Brian. And so that ends public comment. I'll just make a note that as was supported earlier, the committee will next meet on November 29th, 2022 at 9 a.m. And if there is no other business at this time, we're going to adjourn. Thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing all of you in late November. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you all.
Thanks, Brian, and see you again.
Thanks, Garland.